It is January 330 BCE, and deep in the frozen heart of the Zagros Mountains, the most dangerous army on the face of the earth is about to walk straight into a trap. Alexander of Macedon has already done the impossible. He has crossed the Hellespont, shattered the Persian cavalry at Granicus, outmaneuvered Darius at Issus, and annihilated the largest assembled army the ancient world has ever seen on the plains of Gaugamela. The great king has fled. Babylon opened its gates without a fight. Susa, one of the richest cities in existence, simply handed over its keys and its treasury. There is no Persian field army left. No organized force stands between Alexander and the final prize, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the city of Persepolis. But there is one problem. To reach it, Alexander must pass through a narrow corridor of rock and ice carved into the mountains, a place the Persians call the Persian Gate. It is barely wide enough for a column of soldiers to march through, and Alexander, riding at the head of roughly 17,000 troops, has no idea what is waiting for him on the ridgelines above. As the Macedonian column pushes deeper into the narrowing gorge, the walls of rock on either side begin to climb higher. The sky shrinks to a sliver. The pass twists. The light shifts. And then the front of the column slams to a halt. Ahead, blocking the entire width of the road, stands a solid barricade of earth and stone. Before anyone can react, the mountains come alive. Boulders crash down from the heights. Arrows pour in from both slopes at once, striking at steep angles that shields cannot fully deflect. There is no room to form ranks. There is no space to wheel cavalry. The phalanx, the most feared infantry formation in the ancient world, is useless here. Soldiers at the rear of the column, unable to see what is happening ahead, continue pressing forward, compressing the men in front into a tighter and tighter killing zone. Casualties mount with terrifying speed. And then something happens that has not happened once in the entire campaign. Alexander orders a retreat. The Macedonians pull back, leaving their dead behind in the gorge, a violation of Greek military honor so severe that it would haunt any commander who allowed it. The road to Persepolis is sealed. The conquest has stalled. And now the question becomes very simple. How does Alexander finish the war if he cannot reach the capital? Because within a matter of days, he is going to attempt the single most dangerous maneuver of the entire campaign. And if it fails, the conquest of Persia dies in these mountains. To understand how Alexander ended up pinned down in a frozen mountain pass in the middle of winter, you have to go back a few weeks, to a moment when everything seemed to be going perfectly. After the catastrophic defeat at Gaugamela, the Persian Empire did not so much collapse as simply stop resisting. Babylon, one of the oldest and grandest cities in the world, opened its gates to Alexander without a single sword being drawn. The army was given roughly a month to rest, which it desperately needed. Reinforcements arrived from Greece, Macedonia, and Thrace, swelling the ranks. Alexander began making administrative appointments, and in one of the most telling decisions of his career, he allowed Mazaeus, the Persian commander who had actually fought against him at Gaugamela, to retain his position as satrap of Babylon. It was a small gesture, but it revealed something enormous about Alexander's thinking. He was no longer simply conquering. He was beginning to rule. He was absorbing the Persian imperial structure rather than demolishing it. And that shift in approach would define the rest of his reign. From Babylon, Alexander moved southeast to Susa, and once again, the city surrendered without resistance. But what Alexander found inside Susa's treasury changed the nature of the war. Tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver, an almost incomprehensible fortune, now belonged to him. This was not just wealth. This was strategic independence. Alexander immediately sent a portion of the money westward to Antipater, his regent in Macedonia, who was dealing with Spartan-led unrest back in Greece. With that single shipment, Alexander ensured that his rear was secure and that his campaign could continue indefinitely without relying on funding from home. But he did not settle in for the winter. He did not rest, because Darius was still alive. And as long as Darius drew breath, Persian legitimacy survived. Provincial governors could still rally to the great king. Satraps could still claim they were fighting for the rightful ruler. The empire was wounded, yes, but it was not dead. To kill it, Alexander had to do more than win battles. He had to enter Persis itself, the ancestral homeland of the Achaemenid dynasty, and he had to take Persepolis, the ceremonial capital where Persian kings were crowned and buried. Only then would the symbolism of conquest match the military reality. So Alexander marched south, into the teeth of winter, toward the Zagros Mountains. The Zagros Range is one of the great natural barriers of the ancient world, a jagged wall of peaks and valleys separating the lowlands of Mesopotamia from the Iranian plateau. To cross it, Alexander made a decision that reveals both his brilliance and his appetite for risk. He divided his army. Parmenion, his most experienced general, was given command of the baggage train, the Thessalian cavalry, and the allied Greek contingents. Parmenion would take the royal road, the longer but safer route that wound through more passable terrain. Alexander himself would take the shorter, more direct path through the high mountain passes, leading a strike force of roughly 17,000 to 20,000 of his best troops. Speed mattered more than safety. Before he reached the Persian Gate, however, Alexander encountered the Uxians, a fiercely independent mountain tribe that had maintained its autonomy for generations by demanding tribute from every army that passed through their territory. Even the Persian kings had paid. Alexander refused. He launched a rapid campaign against the Uxian settlements, subdued them in a matter of days, and imposed tribute on them instead, flipping the entire power dynamic on its head. It was a decisive and brutal demonstration of force, but it also had an unintended consequence. After the Uxians, resistance in the mountains seemed to evaporate. The column advanced without interruption. Scouting was reduced. Confidence was high. And that confidence is exactly what made the Persian Gate so devastating. The approach to the pass begins with a wide, open plain stretching roughly 2 kilometers across. There is no visible sign of organized defense, no fortifications, no enemy formations. To the Macedonian scouts riding ahead, it looked like another uncontested advance. The column entered the narrowing defile at full march speed, but as the walls closed in, the geography changed dramatically. At its most critical point, the pass narrows to just a few meters wide, with sheer ridges towering on both sides. The road curves to the southeast, and in the morning hours, the angle of the sun made it nearly impossible to see clearly toward the upper slopes. Figures on the ridgeline, if they were spotted at all, were likely assumed to be displaced civilians or shepherds, not soldiers. No alarm was raised. And then the vanguard hit the wall. A barricade of packed earth and stone stretched across the full width of the pass. In the same instant, the trap was sprung. Boulders were rolled down the slopes with calculated precision. Archers stationed on both ridgelines opened fire simultaneously, creating overlapping fields of missile fire that turned the floor of the pass into a killing ground. The Macedonians were caught in the worst possible configuration, strung out in a long, narrow column with no room to expand, no room to charge, and no room to form any kind of defensive perimeter. Soldiers in the rear, hearing the commotion but unable to see, continued to push forward, driving the men ahead of them deeper into the ambush. The congestion was catastrophic. Men fell and were trampled. Shields could not be raised effectively against fire coming from such steep angles above. Alexander, who had never been in a situation like this, recognized immediately that there was no tactical solution available in the moment. He ordered the withdrawal. The army pulled back, bleeding, disorganized, and for the first time in the entire campaign, genuinely defeated. The man responsible for this was Ariobarzanes, the satrap of Persis. He was not some minor provincial official. He was a veteran of Gaugamela, a man who had watched the full might of the Persian Empire crumble on an open battlefield and drawn the correct conclusion. You do not fight Alexander in the open. You do not give him room to maneuver. You do not let his cavalry find your flanks or his phalanx close the distance. Instead, you find the ground that neutralizes all of his advantages, and you force him to fight on your terms. The Persian Gate was that ground. Ancient sources claim Ariobarzanes had between 25 and 40,000 defenders, but modern historians generally believe the actual number was significantly lower, perhaps a fraction of those figures. It did not matter. In terrain this confined, position was everything and numbers were almost irrelevant. A relatively small force, properly placed on the heights with a solid barricade blocking the road, could hold indefinitely against an army many times its size. And Ariobarzanes knew exactly what he was doing. He did not advance. He did not pursue the retreating Macedonians. He simply held his ground and let the mountains do the work. His purpose was not to destroy Alexander. It was to buy time. Darius had withdrawn to Media, and if Ariobarzanes could delay the Macedonian advance long enough, the great king might yet assemble a new army. Alexander now faced a dilemma with no obvious solution. The phalanx was useless in the pass. A second frontal assault would produce the same result. A smaller Persian force, well supplied and occupying the high ground, could hold the gate for weeks or even months, and winter was tightening its grip on the mountains, compressing Alexander's supply lines and making every day of delay more dangerous. For perhaps the only time in his career, Alexander was stuck. What happened next is one of the most debated episodes in the sources. The ancient accounts differ on the details, but the broad strokes are consistent. Alexander obtained intelligence about an alternate route through the mountains, a secondary path that wound around and behind the Persian position. Some sources say the information came from prisoners. Others credit a local shepherd who knew the terrain intimately. Whoever provided the intelligence, Alexander acted on it immediately. He divided his forces yet again, a bold move for a commander who had just been ambushed. Roughly 3,000 infantry were left in the camp at the mouth of the pass. Their job was deception. Extra campfires were lit at night. Activity was maintained at normal levels. Every effort was made to convince the Persians on the heights that the entire Macedonian army was still sitting in place, licking its wounds. A second detachment was assigned to secure a portion of the mountain route and prepare for a supporting attack along the ridgeline. And Alexander himself took the main striking force on a grueling march along a distant northern path that climbed high into the frozen peaks before descending behind Ariobarzanes' defenses. The march took approximately 2 days. The conditions were brutal. Cold air cut through armor. The footing was treacherous, with loose rock and ice making every step uncertain. These were plain soldiers and cavalrymen, not mountain troops, and they were navigating terrain in the dark that would challenge experienced climbers. But they kept moving, and by the morning of the second day, Macedonian units had reached positions overlooking the Persian rear. Ariobarzanes had no idea they were there. The attack was launched at dawn, and it came from three directions at once. From the front, the forces left in camp advanced directly into the pass, making as much noise and presenting as large a threat as possible. Their job was to fix the Persians' attention forward, to make the defenders believe this was simply another frontal assault. From the ridgeline, the second detachment engaged the Persian flanks from elevated ground, suddenly turning the defenders' own terrain advantage against them. And from the rear, Alexander descended from the heights and struck directly into the Persian encampment. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Persians, who had been oriented entirely toward the mouth of the pass, suddenly found themselves under attack from behind and above simultaneously. The very narrowness that had made their position so strong now became a death trap. There was no room to redeploy. There was no space to turn and face the new threat. Units that tried to withdraw found their escape routes blocked by the same terrain that had blocked the Macedonians days earlier. Close combat erupted across the pass. Some Persian defenders, stripped of their weapons, grappled hand-to-hand with Macedonian soldiers, seizing swords and spears from the fallen and fighting with desperate ferocity. It was not a clean rout. It was a bloody, chaotic, close-quarter struggle in a space too small for the number of men fighting in it. Ariobarzanes himself attempted to break out. The sources disagree on his fate. Some say he was killed fighting in the pass. Others say he escaped briefly and was cut down near the walls of Persepolis. What is not disputed is the outcome. By midday, Alexander organized Persian resistance had collapsed entirely. On Persepolis. The Persian Gate was open. Upon his approach, the city's governor, a man named Tiridates, opened negotiations rather than resist. Persepolis fell without a siege, and when Alexander entered the treasury, he found what many historians consider the single largest concentration of portable wealth in the ancient world. Ancient sources estimate roughly 120,000 talents of silver and gold. To put that in perspective, the entire annual revenue of the Athenian Empire at its height was around 400 talents. Alexander had just seized 300 years of Athenian income in a single afternoon. It was a staggering haul, and it cemented his position not just as a conqueror, but as the wealthiest individual alive. For 4 months, Alexander remained in Persepolis, and then, in one of the most controversial acts of his career, the great palace complex was set on fire. The ancient sources cannot agree on why. Some say it was a drunken decision made during a banquet at the urging of a courtesan named Thais. Others argue it was a deliberate and calculated act of symbolic revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Whatever the reason, the flames consumed one of the most magnificent architectural achievements in human history, and the ashes settled on a war that was far from over. Because the burning of Persepolis did not end the conflict. Darius was still alive, still technically the legitimate king of the Persian Empire, and he had fled eastward into Media. Alexander pursued. The chase stretched across hundreds of miles of increasingly unfamiliar terrain, through Media, into Bactria, and then into Sogdiana. And then the news arrived. Darius was dead, but not by Alexander's hand. He had been murdered by his own kinsman, a man named Bessus, who promptly declared himself the new great king. Alexander now had a new enemy and a new justification for continuing the campaign. Bessus was eventually captured and executed. But his brief rebellion was only the beginning. There was no single decisive moment that ended the Persian War. Instead, there were years of grinding local revolts, garrison actions, ambushes, and campaigns to secure territory that seemed pacified one month and hostile the next. The army marched further east with each passing season, pushing beyond the boundaries that anyone in Macedonia had ever imagined. 6 years after the Persian Gate, Alexander stood on the banks of the Indus River, staring across at the army of an Indian king named Porus. Porus did not hide behind walls. He did not set ambushes in mountain passes. He met Alexander on an open battlefield with infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, massive beasts that the Macedonians had never faced in large numbers.